My name's William Davis, and my father's name was Dr. Geoffrey Davis. He was in Bangladesh in, I understand, late 71, but mostly in 72, working with the government in the rehabilitation program, focusing on establishing clinics for women who had been victims of rape during the war, and also for their children, and serving a lot of work on venereal disease. The initial idea was that he would be training people mostly in Dhaka, and working in Dhaka to perform surgeries and to perform to assist births and also to terminate unwanted pregnancies when there was consent. But because of the scale of the operation and because of the scale of the number of people involved, it was initially thought that it was a bit smaller, but now they came to understand that there were thousands upon thousands of people who had been affected by the sort of program of rape. And he had to quickly establish clinics in multiple centers. So he traveled around quite a lot, trying to establish and train paramedics and also the medical students there in his procedures. I can only speak to what he referred to about it and to what he knew of it. But he came through and said that what he found was that there had been thousands upon thousands of rapes throughout the country. And he often referred to it as being a policy or program of the West Pakistani army that they would first, when attacking a city, would use artillery to disrupt or create chaos. They would then have infantry come in, separate out the men and then the women. And the women, everyone above a certain age, would be then divided up, some taken by officers, and others would be taken by general infantry, and that was part of just the routine for taking a city, that would be something that would be done quite often. Since arriving in Bangladesh, I've learned more about what are referred to as rape camps, where they would have basically imprisonment of women civilians, and they would be kept under guard by officers and assaulted and violated. And that a number of accounts came out afterwards of people who had survived. There was one reference. There was one reference that they occasionally would cut the hair of young women in order to not allow not in order to prevent them from hanging themselves with it, and so that would actually be taken from them. And the idea that that was something that was necessary was is dramatic in itself, but it's amazing to hear accounts coming out of that. And then from Dad's experience, he said that one of the difficult things for the program was essentially that they needed to perform these terminations because a lot of the women who had been assaulted and impregnated would then be cast out not only by sort of general society as they had, sort of fathered they had become pregnant and been sort of besmirched or been sullied by the army and by the rape, but also that their families would not accept them back because they felt that they had been dirty, that they had been somehow, they were no longer relevant. So they had nowhere to return to, no escape from that. So not only had they been violated, but they had now, because they were a victim, they were not, of value to society or to their families. So he found that it was incredibly important for this program to be available to people who did want to terminate their pregnancies so that they might be able to return to their families if, that had not been detected or if that was possible. Speaking more to the program, he had some experience speaking to some of the Pakistani officers that were involved, and one of the comments that he's recorded in previous interviews was that when he interviewed them and spoke to them about it, they said, well, it was war. What did they expect us to do? That was just something that happens during war. And so I think that for Dad, that was one of the most compelling things that needed to be remembered, that was just, for them, they interpreted it as being sort of normal, operating procedure for taking a city. That was just something, spoils of war or something like that. And I think that it would be far more important to be able to recognize that now and to interpret it as something that was part and parcel with that sort of ground war. an accusation was made that the Pakistani military command had put this order down from Tika Khan through to the officers, saying that it was important that if they were not going to win the war, that they needed to break Bangladesh and make it so that it could never militarily rise up against Pakistan again. The thought behind it, and this is confusing to me, but the argument behind it was that no Muslim son would ever turn on his father, would never fight against or raise arms against his father. And the idea then being that if most of Bangladesh were the sons of Pakistani servicemen, they were these sort of bastard sons, or they had been fathered by the Pakistan army, that they would not be able to rise up against Pakistan. And it's confusing. It's crazy, but that was the argument that was put forward to Dad by a number of people who were involved in implementing the plan. And it was one of the things that having the strong support of the government at the time and having the strong support of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, that he was able to sort of overcome any roadblocks that he would normally encounter with other countries. One of the most important things he found was actually having access to a field officer who spoke English and was able to translate very quickly for him, because in his other operations, sometimes it was the one thing that would be the most difficult, was needing to have that translator or translation. And in Tunisia, for example, he had great difficulty because he had problems with translation. His field officer didn't speak very good English, and but Bangladesh, he had an incredibly open population, incredibly warm welcome, and also being able to quickly find out what was happening and not having any difficulty in getting access to anything needed on the ground. Resources had to be brought in from overseas, medical shipments from Switzerland and from the UK, but on the ground, everything that could be done for him was done for him. There was a period immediately after the war where they tried to sort of hold people accountable, and they made the Pakistan army was involved in sort of producing a lot of research on it and trying to ascertain whether or not it was sort of hundreds of people or thousands of people who had been affected by this sort of program. And from my understanding, from what I've read from the tribunal, there was documentation produced at the time and then immediately destroyed afterwards, after the finding had been sort of pronounced that there were only hundreds of cases of this, and that was then destroyed. In terms of the knowledge that Dad passed down, the knowledge that Dad sort of wrote about at the time, he was definitely not talking in the number of hundreds. From knowing what we have now about the situation, I just can't understand how there would be a need for so many clinics so far across the country for venereal disease, for emergency pregnancies, for termination of pregnancies, if there was, such a small instance of it. I can't speak from anything but information that was passed down or information that was is now available in journals from his writings at the time, but I'm not aware of it being in the area of hundreds. It wouldn't have kept him there for so long. It's incredibly important that this is at least recognized by the international community as something that happened, and that it's something that, Bangladesh is often referred to as the forgotten genocide, the war that occurred here, and the treatment of the population. But when you add on this element that in the 1970s you had an army operating with a program of sexual assault, and that kind of dehumanization continuing well after the Second World War, which is always referred to as sort of, that's when that kind of stuff happened. But we've gotten better since then. It's incredibly important for that to be recognized, remembered, and to try and have at least lessons learned after that. A large amount of the documentation was taken care of by the government, so he was working basically as the sort of a subject matter expert for the government's rehabilitation program, and then had to take responsibility for what we understand was called the Bangladesh Rehabilitation Program. So it was sort of this generic title that was given to a very broad range of work. The most sort of political part of his work was terminating pregnancies, which meant that a lot of the international agencies that were responsible for funding him and sending him here didn't want to take responsibility for it publicly. It was, at that time, a very dangerous work to be involved in, and he encountered a lot of personal threat working in developed worlds, let alone in developing worlds. So he basically had to document everything that he was doing internally for the organization he was working for, but lists of names and the number of people who were coming through, that was taken care of by the handlers for his operation. I'd say that it's not so much his work, but the articles that he produced during that time were, from everything that we've heard from the tribunal and from what we've heard of the other agencies that were involved, the only public articles that came out about the process of rape, or the sort of systemization of that within Bangladesh during the war. And so his accounts that he put forward in peer reference journals and not peer reference journals, that he put forward in medical journals were extremely valuable to the tribunal now, because they were sort of a Western perspective or an outside independent perspective on what had happened during the war. And so that was of great use to them now. I think the thing that sort of strikes me is that the agencies involved haven't produced more information to the tribunals. I understand, I mean, for even getting myself over here, it took more than a month for people to get in contact with us, even though we were, myself, I was very easy to find. But in terms of getting in contact with the agencies involved, Population Services International would have situation reports that were provided by him, reports on his findings there at the time, reports on what work he had done, numbers of clinics that he'd established, where he'd established them. This kind of information was routinely collected for those kind of projects. And so the idea that that information, no one's reached out to PSI, or no one's reached out to International Planned Parenthood for specifics about that action, I imagine that there is a great amount of information there that has simply been left untouched because of the amount of time that's passed, and also because no one really knew how to connect those dots to find, Dad as one surgeon who was working here is one thing, to get access to his archives is another thing, but to then say, well, he worked for someone has more information about this, and he had to be reporting to somebody, what do they have to say about it? I think there would be a much more valuable amount of information to be obtained from those agencies to find out more about this. He would always talk about how inspired he was by the people he met here, and about how they'd just been through this incredible trauma, but they'd seemed sort of very positive and unaffected. They almost seemed like it had been something they'd just quickly recovered from. I suppose that's part and parcel with the fact that they had now won, or they had had a victory and had liberated their own country. But he was always very positive about his experience with the people there. But when things were brought up that forced him to consider what he had seen when he first arrived, or when he was traveling through, it was quite difficult for him. He was quite emotional when he would have to relate the specifics. So yes, he had, I suppose, throughout my entire life up until we started to have to deal with a lot of the detail of it, it was a overwhelmingly positive response to what he'd seen. I think he'd be touched by receiving a thank you after so long for something that he did as sort of one project that he had done in the series of his work for Population Services International. But I can't speak for Dad. I think he would have been grateful, very grateful for this, and probably, as he said, most of the time whenever he met with the Bangladeshi community, that it was completely unnecessary to provide thanks. It was something that he did because it was part of his work, and something that he wanted to continue doing. He felt very strongly about issues regarding population, and also issues regarding rehabilitation, so this was just up his alley.